The night would feel wrong before anyone could explain why. You step outside, expecting the familiar pale disk that has watched over coastlines, deserts, forests, and sleeping cities for all of human history. Instead, there is another light beside it, another moon, not a star, not a planet, not an illusion caused by cloud or atmosphere. A second world is hanging in the dark above your house, bright enough to cast its own shadows, strange enough to make the entire sky feel suddenly unfamiliar. At first, the shock would be almost childlike. People would point, phones would rise, streets would go quiet in some places and erupt in others. But wonder would not remain wonder for long, because the moon is not just decoration. It pulls at the oceans. It shapes the brightness of night. It has guided animals, calendars, rituals, and the private rhythm of human life for thousands of years. To add another moon is not to add one more object to the sky. It is to change the behavior of the earth itself, and with it, the habits of everyone living on its surface. In reality, our single moon already exerts a powerful gravitational influence, most visibly through the tides. It also lights the night sky, stabilizes the Earth's axial tilt over long timescales, and has left deep marks on myth, timekeeping, and human imagination. So, when we ask what might happen if Earth had two moons, we are not beginning from fantasy alone. We are starting with something real, then carefully extending it into a plausible thought experiment built on gravity, orbital motion, changing tides, brighter nights, and the fragile routines of human civilization. Because the most interesting question is not simply what two moons would look like, it is what they would do to us. How would people sleep beneath a brighter, stranger sky? What would happen to coastal towns if the pull on the oceans became more complex? How would sailors, fishermen, city planners, parents, farmers, believers, and children live inside a world that no longer felt entirely settled? That is why this idea matters. It turns a beautiful image into a human story. It asks how much of our normal life depends on a sky so stable that we rarely think about it at all. It asks whether the sea would grow less predictable, whether darkness would still feel like darkness, and whether the mind could ever relax beneath a sky that had broken trust. Tonight, we are going to follow that change step by step, from the first stunned look upward to the slow remaking of everyday life. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and take one slow breath. Let the noise of the modern world drift a little farther away, and let us step beneath a sky with two moons. At first, almost nobody would go back inside. Curtains would shift. Front doors would open and stay open. Apartment windows would glow a little longer than usual as people leaned into the glass and looked upward, again and again, with the stubborn hope that the sky might correct itself if it were watched closely enough. Yet the second moon would remain where it was, silent and immense, bright enough to cast a second pattern of pale light across rooftops, parked cars, telephone wires, and the wet surface of streets. For a few minutes, perhaps even an hour, the whole event would feel unreal in the softest possible way, like a shared mistake made by the eyes. But the human mind is not built to remain in pure wonder for very long. Once the first astonishment begins to fade, something older begins to take its place. The body understands before the intellect does. If the sky has changed, then safety has changed. If the heavens are no longer behaving as they did yesterday, then perhaps nothing beneath them can be trusted either. That first unease would spread with astonishing speed, because modern people do not experience the world alone. The moment one person steps outside and raises a phone, 1,000 others are drawn into the same instant. Images would rush across networks, live streams would multiply, weather cameras, security cameras, telescopes, dashboard recordings, airport feeds, and shaky videos taken from balconies would all show the same impossible thing from different angles. In deserts, in port cities, in mountain villages, from highways and ferries and offshore rigs, people would see it and confirm it for one another. Even before any government or observatory could release a careful statement, the event would already belong to everyone. It would become global in the oldest sense of the word. A single object in the sky would touch all minds at once. And yet, the first human response would not be uniform. Some would laugh from disbelief. Some would cry without fully knowing why. Parents would wake sleeping children and carry them to windows. Others would do the opposite and keep their children indoors, as though walls could still separate ordinary family life from whatever had just happened above the roof. In some places, people would gather in the streets. In others, they would retreat from them. There would be prayers offered in whispered tones, jokes spoken too loudly, traffic slowing on roads, and a kind of restless standing around that happens when human beings feel compelled to act, but cannot yet decide what action has meaning. The ordinary rhythm of night would break. Restaurants would stop feeling like restaurants. Late trains would stop feeling like late trains. Hospitals, police stations, fishing harbors, and apartment towers would all continue to function, but under a layer of collective distraction so deep that even simple tasks would feel slightly detached from reality. Sleep on that first night would become scarce. The reason would not simply be curiosity. Curiosity can keep a mind awake for an hour. This would be something heavier. Human sleep depends on trust. It depends on the quiet agreement that tonight is fundamentally like last night, that the dark outside contains no new law, no fresh threat, no revision of the world that requires constant vigilance. A second moon would break that agreement at once. Many people would lie in bed and feel the same strange pull to open their eyes again. They would check the curtains, look at the bedside clock, reach for their phones, scroll through updates, then set the phone down and try to settle, only to feel another wave of alertness arrive without warning. For those living near the sea, the problem would be sharper still. If the moon governs tides, what does a second moon govern? If the ocean is being pulled by one familiar companion, what happens when another joins the conversation? In reality, our single moon raises tides because gravity acts differently across the width of the Earth. The side of the planet nearest the moon feels a slightly stronger pull than the center, and the far side behaves differently again. The result is not a simple lifting of the whole ocean like water in a bowl, but a pair of broad bulges that travel as Earth rotates. Coastlines experience those moving bulges according to their shape, depth, orientation, and local geography. The sun also plays an important role, reinforcing the lunar tide at some times and reducing it at others. Even with one moon, tides are not uniform. They are already shaped by orbital mechanics, basins, channels, continental shelves, winds, pressure systems, and the complicated geometry of land and sea. So, if Earth had a second moon, the first honest thing to say is that there would be no single neat pattern repeated everywhere. Some coasts would be affected far more than others. Some harbors might see unusual amplification. Some places might experience timing changes that matter as much as height. The complexity would be immense. That complexity is important because a thoughtful speculation has to begin with limits. A second moon could not simply be imagined at any size, any distance, or any orbit without consequences becoming absurd almost immediately. A large body too close to Earth would be catastrophic. A body too small or too distant might look beautiful but have little practical effect. So, the most useful version of this thought experiment is one in which the second moon is substantial enough to be obvious in the sky and meaningful in the tides, yet stable enough that Earth is not torn into instant disaster. This is not a prediction. It is a controlled act of imagination based on real principles. We are not asking whether magic could place an arbitrary object overhead. We are asking how human life might change if another moon existed in a plausible orbital relationship and exerted a real, lasting influence on light, timing, and the sea. Even under that restrained version, the first practical fear would gather around water. Not because every beach would immediately vanish beneath giant walls of surf, but because coastal people live by repetition. They know, often with remarkable intuition, how the shore usually behaves. They know the hour when mudflats emerge, the hour when the tide presses high against harbor walls, the way moon phase and weather combine, the warning signs before a storm surge, the times when a channel remains safe, and the times when it does not. A second moon would begin by destroying confidence. Imagine a harbor master stepping out under the altered sky and realizing that the tables on which entire routines depend may no longer describe the night ahead. Imagine small fishing crews checking the waterline at midnight, not because they see immediate chaos, but because they no longer know whether the next tide will resemble the last 1,000. The sea, even before it becomes dangerous, would feel offended. The surface would look normal in some places, almost insultingly so. Gentle waves, harbor lights trembling in the black water, mooring lines creaking. Nothing dramatic enough to satisfy the deep alarm rising in the chest. But uncertainty itself is a form of pressure. Emergency agencies would know that they are being asked at once 1,000 local questions that no central authority can answer immediately. How high will the tide be in this town? Will ferries run in the morning? Should marinas be evacuated? Is low ground safe until sunrise? Could there be unusual currents at river mouths? The answers would depend on details so specific that even with excellent science, time would be needed. Models would have to be revised. Observations would have to be gathered from actual coastlines. What happens in one bay could differ greatly from what happens in the next. That lag between event and understanding would be one of the most unnerving features of the first days. Modern civilization often gives the impression that knowledge arrives instantly. In practice, science is powerful because it is careful. Telescopes would track the new object's movement. Orbital calculations would begin at once. Geophysicists, oceanographers, astronomers, and climate scientists would move through the night in control rooms, laboratories, observatories, and emergency briefings, trying to answer several questions at the same time. What is the second moon's orbit? How massive is it likely to be? How bright is it because of size, because of reflectivity, or because of distance? Is its path stable? How will its gravitational effect combine with the existing lunar tide and with the sun? Could resonance amplify certain patterns? Could some coastlines face larger ranges or stranger timing than others? Every answer would matter. Yet the public would experience those first hours
in the opposite order. Fear would arrive first. Explanations would arrive later. And this is where the imagination of ordinary people would begin to outrun the available facts. Human beings are meaning-making animals. When the sky offers an unexplained sign, we do not leave it empty for long. Some would treat it as an omen. Some would declare it a hoax despite seeing it with their own eyes. Some would search sacred texts. Some would speak of simulation, punishment, disclosure, or the end of history. Financial markets, if open, would tremble under the weight of uncertainty. Religious buildings would fill. Some people would drive toward the coast to watch the tide, while others would flee from it. There would be long lines in supermarkets in some regions and eerie calm in others. The event would reveal, with almost embarrassing clarity, how differently humans handle the same shock. One person meets cosmic change by buying bottled water. Another meets it by staring upward until dawn. As night moved toward morning, the second moon would keep changing the texture of darkness itself. This would be one of the most immediate and universal effects after the initial shock. A night lit by one moon can already feel exposed, silvered, almost theatrical. Add another source of reflected sunlight, and the quality of the darkness shifts again. The exact brightness would depend on phase, altitude, albedo, cloud cover, and the relative positions of both moons. But there would be many nights on which landscapes are notably brighter than humanity has known them to be. Shadows might overlap or soften in unfamiliar ways. Hills would hold pale edges longer. Snowfields would shine harder. Water would gleam over greater distances. In cities, the effect might be muted by electric light, yet still felt at
the edge of things, in parks, on rooftops, along waterfronts, in the pale wash on upper windows. In rural regions, it would be stronger, more intimate, impossible to ignore. The psychology of that brightness would be subtle but profound. Human beings evolved under regular cycles of daylight and darkness, with moonlight as a variable but familiar presence. We are not equally comfortable in all kinds of night. Deep darkness can frighten, but it also conceals. It allows rest by withdrawing detail. A brighter night reveals more, and revelation is not always soothing. People sleeping in houses near open land or water might wake because the room feels faintly lit at an hour that should be darker. Curtains that once blocked enough light might no longer suffice. The line between late evening and true night would blur. Insomniacs would feel the change first and describe it best. It would be harder to sink into the deep biological assumption that darkness means retreat. Even those who could not articulate the reason might feel more alert, more watchful, and slightly less surrendered to rest. Children would experience the event in a different register. Adults often respond first by measuring risk, but children notice scale and strangeness before system. Some would be thrilled, telling themselves that the sky has become bigger, richer, more magical. Others would be frightened in the purest way, not because they understand gravity, but because they understand routine. The moon, they know, has always been one thing. Now it is two. The bedtime stories of one night are no longer the bedtime stories of the next. There would be children refusing to close blinds because they need to keep checking, and children begging for blinds to be closed because they do not want to see the sky at all. Teachers, in the days that followed, would meet classrooms full of tired faces and restless questions. Adults often forget how deeply a change in the natural world enters the structure of childhood.
The sky is part of how children learn what forever means. To alter it is to alter an early foundation of trust. Animals, too, would be responding in their own ways, although human observers might notice this unevenly at first. Many species use light cycles, tides, and lunar cues for feeding, movement, breeding, and orientation. Coastal ecosystems in particular are built around rhythm. Intertidal life, nesting behavior, migration, and predator-prey interactions are all tuned to patterns that have persisted over long timescales. A second moon would not rewrite every biological clock overnight, but it would begin to introduce new pressures. Birds that navigate partly by celestial cues could face confusion. Sea turtles, shore creatures, and nocturnal hunters might encounter a night environment that reveals too much or too little at the wrong moment. For humans, these changes would first appear not as a complete ecological theory, but as anecdotes. The fish are behaving strangely. The birds started moving at odd hours. The dogs would not settle. The beach looked wrong at dawn. Small observations would accumulate into a broader sense that the whole living world is trying to renegotiate its timing. Yet the most immediate stories would still come from the shore. By morning, the first truly meaningful tide measurements would begin to arrive. Some locations would likely report deviations that are modest, but unmistakable. The danger here would not lie only in raw height. A slightly different tide arriving at an unfamiliar hour can create problems all its own. Ports are organized by schedule. Ferries run according to expected windows. Channels depend on depth at specific times. Flood-prone roads may remain passable if high water comes in daylight under observation, and much less safe if it arrives earlier or lingers longer. In estuaries and low-lying coastal neighborhoods, even small shifts can matter. So, the first day after the appearance of a second moon would produce maps, advisories, and local warnings that make the change feel real in a new way. A wonder in the sky would become a disruption in the harbor. For people living far inland, that might still seem distant. They would continue to think first of the sky itself, but even there, normal life would have begun to fray. Morning radio and television would no longer be ordinary. Workplaces would struggle to begin the day with any real concentration. Offices would fill with half-finished conversations. Construction,
Crews, teachers, delivery drivers, factory workers, market sellers, pilots, hospital staff, and administrators would all share the same floating distraction. It is difficult to commit fully to ordinary tasks when existence has just revised one of its oldest assumptions. Even those who pride themselves on practicality would feel the drag. There is a special psychological fatigue that comes from standing on the border between old normal and new normal. The mind wastes energy trying to decide whether to keep treating the world as stable or to start bracing for something much larger. Governments would have to perform calm before they truly possessed it. Public statements in the first 24 hours would almost certainly lean toward caution, order, and provisional language. There would be appeals not to panic, requests to avoid coastal risk zones until updated guidance could be provided, and repeated reminders that not every dramatic image circulating online reflects typical conditions everywhere. Scientists would appear beside officials, trying to separate what is already known from what is still being modeled. This distinction would matter enormously. If they overstated certainty, trust could collapse later. If they emphasized uncertainty too strongly, fear could outrun them. The art of the first briefing would lie in speaking clearly about complexity. Yes, the second moon is real.
Yes, it may alter tides and night brightness. No, that does not mean every shoreline will instantly flood. Yes, further data are needed. No, that is not the same as having no understanding at all. Still, reassurance would have limits, because people do not evaluate risk in a vacuum. They evaluate it through memory, imagery, and instinct. A person who has lived through coastal flooding before would hear the word tide differently from someone who has not. A person whose grandparents lost a house to the sea would understand the new sky through family history. Whole regions of the world already live with the knowledge that water can cross familiar boundaries. Storm surge, king tides, river flooding, subsidence, erosion, and sea level rise have taught millions that the line between land and water is neither permanent nor morally fair. A second moon would pour itself into that existing vulnerability. It would not begin in an empty world. It would begin in one already anxious about coasts, already unevenly protected, already divided between those who can afford to move and those who cannot. This is why the early days would produce not just fear, but triage. Insurance companies would begin assessing exposure. Shipping firms would pause and revise. Coastal authorities would check seawalls, drainage systems, and evacuation routes. Engineers would look at tide records, historical flood maps, and local topography with fresh urgency. Satellite data, tide gauges, and field observations would become precious. In some places, the findings would be reassuring. In others, they would be deeply unsettling. The challenge would not only be that conditions have changed, but that the change might express itself through repeating patterns that are not yet understood. If two moons create more complicated cycles, then a harbor that appears manageable on day 1 may face a more difficult alignment on day 6 or day 13. People would realize, slowly, that they are not just dealing with a single extraordinary event. They are trying to learn a new rhythm before that rhythm has fully declared itself. The sea has always inspired both reverence and suspicion because it is never truly fixed. Yet, under ordinary conditions, human beings make agreements with it. We build seawalls and harbors, estimate risks, set mooring lines, and tell ourselves that if we respect the tide tables, if we monitor the weather, if we understand the season, the water will remain broadly legible. A second moon would attack legibility. That may sound abstract, but it is a deeply physical fear. To stand near a shoreline and feel that the old patterns no longer hold is to feel exposed in a very ancient way. Land is supposed to be the stable thing. Sea is supposed to be the moving thing. When the boundary between them begins to feel negotiable, a primitive alertness wakes up. It is the same alertness that made our ancestors search higher ground, read riverbanks, watch storm clouds, and calculate distance from shelter. It does not need advanced knowledge. It only needs a hint that the world may
cross into the place where the body sleeps. Imagine, then, a low coastal town on the second or third night. Nothing as dramatic as the movies would prefer, no impossible wall of water racing under moonlight. Instead, a more patient dread. The tide is arriving higher than expected, or at least higher than residents are comfortable seeing it. Water moves into the usual vulnerable places first: a parking area near the marina, the bottom of a stairwell, a road that often floods in storms but is now flooding in calmer weather, a cluster of docks with their lines pulled taut at angles that make experienced fishermen swear softly under their breath. People come out with flashlights and phones. Neighbors compare old memories. Someone says it has never reached that point except during a bad storm. Someone else insists they remember one year when it came close. The argument barely matters.
The real fact is not whether the water has done this once before under extreme conditions. The real fact is that tonight it is doing it under a sky that no one knows how to read. Under those circumstances, fear spreads horizontally. It passes from house to house, block to block, not through direct catastrophe, but through attention. One person notices water at the curb. Another notices the brightness of the flooded street. Another remembers that the next high tide could be worse if the moons align differently. Another reads an advisory on a local phone alert. Another watches a live camera from a nearby harbor. Before long, the entire neighborhood is thinking about the sea. This is a form of social weather that modern systems cannot prevent. Once enough people are looking at the same risk, the risk becomes emotional as well as physical. Sleep drains away again. In places like this, the first week would feel unusually long. Every tide cycle would divide time more sharply than the clock. People would begin to ask not what day it is, but what the water is doing tonight. If the altered tides became one source of strain, the other would be the continued presence of the second moon itself. Because it would not pass like lightning or a comet, it would remain. That endurance would matter more than the first appearance. Human beings can tolerate a brief break in normality if it can be absorbed into a story. A storm passes, an eclipse ends, a meteor shower fades before dawn. But a new moon that stays in the sky asks for something else. It asks for adaptation. Each evening would become a fresh confrontation between memory and reality. You would go outside to take out the trash, close a gate, walk the dog, smoke on a balcony, or drive home from work, and there they would be, 2 moons where one ought to be. Repetition would not make the sight trivial, it would make it deeper. The mind would slowly realize that this is no longer an event. It is now part of the architecture of existence. Astronomers would help the world understand the geometry of what was happening, and their calm would be one of the few stabilizing forces in the early period. They would explain that the appearance of the moons would change with orbital position. Sometimes both might be visible together for long stretches. Sometimes one would rise later. Sometimes one would set while the other remained. Their phases might differ depending on orbit. Eclipses and near alignments could occur. The beauty of such scenes would be undeniable, perhaps even overwhelming. But science would keep insisting on the deeper point. The visual spectacle matters because it reflects real orbital relationships, and those relationships have real consequences. The shape of the tide, the timing of light, the predictability of cycles, all of these would depend on motion. People would begin to learn a new celestial literacy, not because they suddenly became romantics, but because practical life would demand it. There is something quietly humbling about that possibility. For centuries, large parts of modern humanity have lived in ways that reduce dependence on the night sky. Urban lighting softens darkness. Digital calendars replace celestial observation. Work shifts, supermarkets, and climate-controlled interiors make daily existence feel detached from orbital realities. The moon remained above us, of course, influencing oceans and imagination alike, but many people could move through entire weeks without really looking at it. A second moon would end that casual indifference. The sky would become relevant again.
Not as an ornament, but as infrastructure. People would watch it the way they watch weather now. They would begin to ask which moon is fuller, which one is rising, what tomorrow's tide may do, whether the coming week contains a troublesome alignment. The heavens would recover their practical authority over ordinary thought. That renewed attention would also reshape the emotional life of cities. Urban residents often imagine themselves insulated from natural rhythms, yet cities are full of exposed thresholds, subways near rivers, storm drains, waterfront districts, power infrastructure, tunnels, ports, airports on reclaimed land, apartment towers facing open water, old neighborhoods built lower than the planners of previous centuries understood. A complex tidal regime would not strike every city equally, but where it mattered, it would matter through systems. Commuters might discover that certain routes flood more often. Utility managers might confront saltwater intrusion risks. Emergency services might begin treating particular nights with greater caution. The city would not cease being a city, but a certain arrogance might drain out of it. It would remember, perhaps unwillingly, that concrete does not exempt human beings from celestial mechanics. Meanwhile, inland cultures would process the change more symbolically at first. Art would respond immediately. Musicians, writers, photographers, and filmmakers would try to capture the strange double light of evening. Religious language would multiply. Some communities would interpret the second moon as a test, others as a sign of coming transformation, still others as evidence that human understanding has always been provisional. Social media would be full of competing emotional scripts: awe, dread, denial, irony, devotion. A fascinating feature of the first week would be the sheer abundance of language generated around one new object. When people do not know what a thing means, they produce metaphors at speed. The moon would become a mirror for every existing worldview. That does not mean the meanings would be equally valid scientifically, but it does mean that the human impact would never be purely material. We live in facts, yes, but also in stories told about facts, and those stories help decide how calmly or violently societies move through uncertainty. The first week would also reveal how unevenly different people are able to inhabit uncertainty. Scientists can work inside it. They are trained to distinguish confidence from speculation and to update models as evidence accumulates. Most ordinary lives do not function so comfortably that way. A family wants to know whether their coast is safe, not how parameter ranges are still being refined. A port authority wants to know whether to close. A parent wants to know whether school will open. A small fisherman wants to know if he can launch before dawn without risking his boat. A person living alone in a coastal apartment wants to know whether to sleep or remain half-dressed with a bag near the door. These are not abstract questions. They are the questions by which a new celestial arrangement enters the intimate space of human vulnerability. And so, while the science would continue improving hour by hour, the lived experience of the first week would remain heavy. People would notice how conversation had changed. It would become difficult to talk about ordinary matters for long without the moons returning to the center of the room. Weddings, business meetings, classroom lessons, sports broadcasts, and family meals would all tilt toward the same subject. Every society has moments when a single fact swallows the background and becomes the atmosphere through which all other things are felt. This would be one of those moments. Yet, atmosphere does not stay static. Slowly, a second stage would begin. The world would not feel less strange, exactly, but it would start to feel less suspended. Measurements would accumulate. Patterns would emerge. Some fears would be confirmed. Others would soften. People would realize that the challenge is no longer to survive a shocking night beneath a changed sky, but to continue living, working, raising children, crossing coastlines,
and sleeping under it. In that interval between fear and adaptation, measurements would begin to acquire moral weight. A tide gauge is a simple instrument compared with the grandeur of 2 moons, yet in moments like this, civilization leans on simple instruments.
Numbers from stations around the world would be checked, compared, corrected, and checked again. Oceanographers would not merely ask whether the water was higher, but how timing, range, and local response were shifting. In some regions, the changes might be modest enough to calm people temporarily. In others, unusual combinations of bathymetry and coastline shape could make the difference sharper. Narrow bays, estuaries, tidal flats, and river mouths might respond in complicated ways. The public would learn, perhaps for the first time, that a tide is not a universal event arriving equally everywhere. It is a global force translated through local geography. That truth would become newly vivid as neighboring communities discovered that the same sky could produce very different nights. This would also be the moment when maps start to redraw the emotional geography of the world. Before the second moon, a person's sense of risk might depend mostly on weather, economics, politics, or geology. After it, proximity to water would take on new meaning. A town that once treated the sea as scenery might begin to see it as a conditional neighbor. Real estate markets would not transform overnight, but conversations would. Families with elderly relatives in low-lying homes would begin discussing relocation. Harbor businesses would start calculating costs. Insurance questions would move from technical paperwork to dinner table talk. Places that had spent years balancing comfort against coastal danger would now be forced to imagine that the balance itself had changed. The shoreline would cease to be a backdrop and become a daily decision. News coverage would intensify this feeling by learning, very quickly, which images carried the strongest emotional charge. The most shared scenes would not necessarily be the most scientifically representative. They would be the most humanly legible. Moonlight on flooded streets, fishing boats scraping too high against pilings, families carrying belongings through shallow water, children staring upward from apartment roofs, old men at seawalls watching the tide in silence, city skylines under 2 pale discs. These images would define the first week in the public imagination. They would persuade inland viewers that the event had entered the realm of material life, and they would persuade coastal viewers that what they were feeling was not private anxiety, but the beginning of a shared historical condition. Once an event acquires imagery, it settles more deeply into memory. Fatigue would become another quiet force. Even those far from immediate danger would be sleeping less, reading too much, checking updates late into the night, and carrying a low-grade unease through the day. This matters because fear is rarely strongest at the first shock. Sometimes it matures through exhaustion. After several nights of poor sleep, the mind becomes more vulnerable to dread, less patient with uncertainty, and more likely to imagine the worst. Hospitals would not fill because of the moons alone, but doctors would certainly see the indirect consequences of stress, elevated anxiety, heart symptoms worsened by panic, insomnia, confusion in vulnerable patients, and the simple wear that comes from a nervous system denied closure. The body prefers events that end. A second moon would refuse to provide that ending. There would also be a social divide between those who could afford to treat the new sky as a spectacle and those who could not. For a traveler in a mountain lodge or a wealthy family far from tidal risk, 2 moons might remain beautiful first and troubling second. For a dock worker, a coastal renter, a ferry crew,
or someone whose savings are tied to a fragile piece of shoreline property, beauty would be harder to enjoy. This difference would shape the tone of public conversation. One part of humanity would speak the language of wonder, another would speak the language of exposure. Both would be telling the truth from where they stood, but the second truth would carry the heavier burden, because it is always easier to admire a changed world from high ground. By the end of the first week, one thing would be unmistakable. The event would no longer belong to rumor, and it would no longer belong only to astonishment. Enough observations would exist to confirm that the second moon was not a harmless ornament. Enough nights would have passed to show that darkness itself had been altered. Enough tides would have come and
gone to prove that coasts were entering a more complicated age. The first stunned look upward would already be receding into memory, replaced by a more demanding question. Not what has happened, but how life must now be arranged around it. And that is where the deeper story truly begins, because surviving surprise is one thing. Learning the habits of a world that has changed above your head, along your shoreline, and inside your sleep is something else entirely. Soon, people would stop asking whether the old normal might return and start asking heavier questions. Which coasts could still be trusted? Which nights would still feel restful? And what kind of human routine could survive beneath a permanently rewritten sky? Soon, the question would stop being whether people were frightened and become something much harder to answer. How do you organize a life beneath a sky that has acquired a second clock? In the first days, most people would still be measuring the event in emotion, in sleeplessness, in anxious glances toward the shoreline or the window. But human beings cannot remain in a state of pure astonishment forever. Bills still arrive, children still need breakfast, buses still run, hospitals still open, boats still leave harbor, and the body still expects a pattern to carry it from one day into the next. So, almost without noticing it, humanity would begin the slow, awkward work of making the impossible ordinary. That work would begin with time itself. Long before modern schedules were kept by screens and synchronized networks, people used the sky as a calendar, a rough clock, and a source of order. The moon mattered because it changed visibly and predictably. It gave shape to months, to rituals, to planting traditions, to fasting periods, to navigational habits, to stories told at the edge of the fire. Even now, in a world filled with digital precision, the old lunar inheritance remains everywhere. Languages preserve it, religions preserve it, farmers, fishers, and coastal communities preserve it. A second moon would not erase those old patterns at once, but it would force them into a new and more complicated relationship. One visible cycle had become two. One familiar rhythm of waxing and waning had become an arrangement of shifting overlaps, separations, convergences, and interruptions. At first, people would try to simplify the problem. They always do. Which one is the real moon? Which one matters more? Which cycle should calendars follow? These questions would appear childish to astronomers, yet they would be deeply human. Most people do not want a sky full of equally important motions. They want a hierarchy. They want to know which light to trust. But a two-moon world would resist such neat emotional ordering. If the new moon were large enough to alter tides and bright enough to transform the night, then it would not be a decorative companion. It would matter. Yet the old moon would matter too, because it would still be bound into everything humanity had inherited from the previous world. The result would be a strange cultural tension. One moon would carry memory, the other would carry disruption, and both
would now share the same sky. This would be felt in the smallest corners of domestic life. Imagine a kitchen calendar hanging beside a refrigerator door. For generations, a family may barely have looked at lunar phases except as a curiosity. Now, the pattern becomes practical again. Which nights will be brightest? Which nights might bring awkward tides to the road by the marina? Which dates now fall under unusual alignments? At first, these questions would appear in local news, weather apps, tide updates, school announcements, and neighborhood conversations. Then they would begin sinking into ordinary speech. People would say things like, "Wait until the two crescents are offset," or "The higher water should come after the smaller moon rises," or "Next week might be worse because both lights are full at nearly the same time." A new sky vocabulary would grow not from poetry alone, but from repeated need. Religious calendars would face a more delicate challenge. Traditions, shaped partly by lunar observation, do not change easily, because they are not simply systems for counting days, they are systems for holding memory, obedience, and continuity. A second moon would pose questions that no previous generation had needed to settle. If a fast begins by the sighting of a crescent, which crescent now matters? If months are
Tied to lunar appearance, how does one preserve inherited practice beneath a rewritten sky? Different communities would answer differently. Some would preserve the old moon as the rightful measure and treat the new one as cosmically important but liturgically secondary. Others would argue that divine creation has presented a new reality and must therefore be read anew. Still others would split, not in violence at first, but in interpretation, producing fresh schools of thought built around celestial change. The debate would not be a side effect, it would be part of how humanity metabolizes the event. Because people do not merely inhabit time, they sanctify it. Secular life would prove no less vulnerable. Work schedules might remain digital, but digital schedules still sit on top of biological and environmental rhythms. Tides influence ports, ferries, fisheries, and estuaries. Night brightness influences sleep. Anxiety influences concentration. The result would be a calendar that remains formally familiar, but feels subtly wrong from underneath. Weeks would continue to have 7 days, yet some coastal workers might begin organizing their private sense of strain around particular alignments of the moons rather than around weekends. Parents might dread certain bright nights because children sleep poorly before school. Emergency planners might identify recurring combinations that produce nuisance flooding in low districts. Tourist towns might discover that some nights draw crowds, while others bring cancellations and caution. In other words, official time would continue, but lived time would begin to drift toward the new sky. That drift would be easier to manage for some people than for others. A city resident in an upper-floor apartment far from the water might experience 2 moons mainly as altered light and cultural novelty. A person living on a vulnerable coast would encounter them as a recurring practical test. This is one of the most important truths about environmental change. It does not spread its burden evenly. It arrives through geography, income, occupation, and architecture. In a 2-moon world, that inequality would become impossible to ignore. The same pair of celestial bodies that inspire awe in one place might unsettle mortgage values in another. One person would photograph the horizon, another would stack belongings higher in the garage. Who, then, would still choose to live by the water? At first, almost everyone who already did. Human beings are slow to abandon familiar ground,
especially when their identity is woven into it. Coastlines are not just pieces of territory, they are home, memory, livelihood, inheritance, beauty, and status. They are where families have lived for generations, where boats are moored, where the weather is known by smell, where a certain kind of evening light feels like part of the self. Even when the risks deepen, people do not immediately leave such places, because leaving is not only a financial decision, it is an act of psychological dislocation. A person can understand that the shoreline is less trustworthy now, and still wake each morning unable to imagine belonging anywhere else. So the first stage would not be mass retreat, it would be sorting. Wealthier households in exposed districts might quietly begin looking inland or uphill. Insurance premiums, where insurance remained available at all, would sharpen the issue. Investors would be quicker than families, and second home owners quicker than those with nowhere else to go. Real estate markets in the most vulnerable coastal zones would likely show the earliest signs of change, because markets translate fear into numbers with ruthless speed. But numbers never tell the whole story. The people left behind would not simply be the reckless. Many would be those whose work, savings, family obligations, or lack of alternatives kept them in place. This is how environmental inequality often hardens, not because one group loves danger more than another, but because one group has more freedom to turn uncertainty into relocation. Fishing communities would embody this tension with painful clarity. A fishing town is rarely just a cluster of houses near a harbor. It is a web of habits built around launch times, tides, weather windows, maintenance rhythms, auction hours, fuel deliveries, and inherited local knowledge. If the tidal pattern becomes more difficult to predict, the disruption spreads beyond the boat itself. Delays affect
The market. Unusual currents affect safety. Harbor access windows shift. Traditional experience becomes less reliable, not because it was foolish, but because the environment it mastered has changed. For older fishers, this would carry a special sadness. Their authority often rests on years of close reading, the pull of water around a breakwater, the sound of current against pilings, the look of the estuary under a rising moon. A second moon would not make that knowledge worthless, but it would make it incomplete, and incompleteness in skilled work can feel like a wound. Imagine a harbor just before dawn, some months into this new era. The town has not been abandoned. Boats still line the quay, nets still smell of salt and old labor, gulls still circle with impolite certainty. Yet the conversations are different now. Men and women who once spoke mainly of weather, fuel, catch, and equipment now also speak of orbital timing, local anomalies, the moon charts on their phones, the night tide that lingered longer than expected, the channel that seemed safe until it wasn't, the shoal that shifted under a recent sequence of high poles. None of this turns them into astronomers. It turns them into what human beings have always been at their best and most burdened, adapters. But adaptation has a cost. Every extra variable adds strain. Every uncertainty lengthens the day before it begins. Ports of all kinds would face a similar but larger challenge. Commercial shipping depends on timing, depth, predictability, and infrastructure. Many major ports already cope with tidal complexity, dredging demands, storm surges, and long-term sea level concerns. Add a second moon, and even without imagining dramatic catastrophe, the operational complexity deepens. Harbor authorities would need revised tidal models, updated docking protocols, new margins for safety, and better coordination with pilots. Some ports might prove resilient because their geography buffers the change,
or their engineering is already robust. Others would discover that modest shifts in range or timing disrupt schedules enough to cost money and confidence. Freight is a quiet foundation of civilization. Most people never think of it while shelves are full. Yet, if ports become more fragile, the consequences ripple outward into prices, delays, labor, maintenance, and political argument. Energy infrastructure near coasts would also become a source of concern. Power plants, fuel depots, substations, cable landings, and transport networks are often concentrated in places shaped by old assumptions about water. Those assumptions are not static, even in our present world, which is why engineers already spend so much effort on flood maps and protective design. In a world with 2 moons, the challenge would not necessarily be that every facility is overwhelmed. It would be that planners must decide whether recurring high water events are exceptions or the beginning of a durable new baseline. Engineering loves certainty, or at least well-bounded uncertainty. A second moon would offer neither at first. Designers would have to study not only maximum possible levels, but repeating combinations, seasonal effects, regional amplification, and the uncomfortable gap between model and lived reality. And while all of this was happening in systems and institutions, the private mind would be negotiating its own transformation. Sleep would become one of the most intimate battlegrounds. Scientists already know that light influences circadian rhythms, helping regulate melatonin, wakefulness, body temperature, and the timing of sleep. Artificial light has altered that rhythm profoundly in modern societies, yet natural night still matters, especially in rural places and in the unconscious texture of what rest feels like. 2 moons would not plunge every person into permanent insomnia, but many would notice that some nights no longer seem properly dark. Bedrooms would hold more reflected glow. Curtains would have to be changed. Sleep masks would become common. Night workers returning home might find it harder to persuade their bodies that rest had permission to begin. But beyond the biology lies something even harder to measure. Rest is not only chemistry, it is surrender. To sleep well, the mind must feel that vigilance can be loosened. A brighter, stranger sky would interfere with that surrender in subtle ways. People might dream more vividly on certain nights, not because the moons cast mystical spells, but because stress, light, and novelty shape the dreaming brain. Children might wake more often and ask to sleep near parents. Elderly people, especially those already prone to fragmented sleep, might find the changed light deeply unsettling. In many households, bedtime would become a negotiation rather than a decline. The old quiet of night would feel thinner. There is a particular loneliness in altered nights. During the day, change is distributed through crowds, screens, traffic, meetings, tasks, and conversation. At night, it returns to the individual body. A person lying awake under 2 moons would not merely be thinking about astronomy. They would be thinking about whether tomorrow's tide might cut the road again, whether the children will be exhausted for school, whether the family can afford thicker curtains, whether the old house by the water is still wise, whether the world their grandparents described has now ended in a way that cannot be reversed. This is how large planetary changes become domestic. They enter not only through official briefings and emergency alerts, but through the tiny decisions made in the darkness between midnight and dawn. The psychological divide between generations would deepen here as well. Adults who had lived most of their lives under 1 moon would carry a lingering sense of violation. Even after months or years, many of them would still remember the old sky, not just as a fact, but as a condition of identity. They would speak about it with a tone once reserved for vanished neighborhoods or extinct customs. Younger children, by contrast, would adapt faster. Not instantly, but faster. If a child is very young when the second moon appears, then 2 moons soon become normal in the ruthless, flexible way childhood normality works. This would create an eerie household contrast. Parents would pull the curtains and talk about the world changing. Their children would draw 2 moons in school without self-consciousness. That change in childhood imagination would matter. Children do not just inherit facts, they inherit what counts as ordinary. Their rhymes, drawings, games, fears, and bedtime questions would begin absorbing the new sky long before they could understand orbital mechanics. Picture books would be redrawn. Nursery decorations would shift. School science lessons would begin with 2 moon cycles rather than 1. Questions that once belonged to speculative fiction would become the most basic kind of classroom curiosity. Which moon is brighter tonight? Why are both shadows visible on the playground? Why is Grandma still scared of something that has always been there? The generation born after the change would quietly become the first truly native population of the 2-moon Earth. They would not think of themselves that way at first. No generation ever notices, while still young, how historically strange its ordinary life really is. Yet, adaptation in children would not mean the transition is painless. Brighter nights can disrupt sleep. New fears can arise from repetition as well as novelty. Some children would become fascinated to the point of obsession, tracking phases, collecting moon images, refusing to stop talking about alignments and tides. Others would absorb adult anxiety and develop a diffuse dread of coastlines, darkness, or weather. Teachers and psychologists would notice the difference between children who found comfort in explanation and children who remained haunted by the idea that the sky itself had proved unstable. These responses would vary by personality, by family tone, by geography, and by whether the child's home was physically exposed to tidal change. A child in an inland suburb and a child in a flood-prone coastal town would be growing up beneath the same 2 moons, but not inside the same emotional universe. The world of work would continue reshaping itself around these differences. Farmers, for example, might not be directly threatened by tides in the way fishers are, but they would still live under altered nights and altered calendars. Agricultural traditions have long been influenced, in some places strongly and in others loosely, by lunar timing. Even where modern farming is driven by machinery and market contracts rather than moon lore, rural life is still sensitive to light, weather, and the behavior of animals. Brighter nights might affect livestock routines, pest patterns, or the simple experience of moving through fields before dawn.
Most changes would be local and subtle rather than universally dramatic. But subtle changes, repeated over seasons, can still alter habit. Farmers are often among the first to notice when the natural background has become a little less legible than it used to be. Tourism would create its own peculiar adaptations. Some regions would market the 2-moon sky as a wonder, drawing visitors to elevated viewpoints, deserts, quiet beaches, and mountain observatories. Hotels would advertise twin moon nights. Photographers would chase reflections. Honeymoon destinations would reinvent themselves around the altered heavens. Yet, alongside that beauty would be tension. The very coasts most attractive to visitors might also be those increasingly troubled by water management and infrastructure strain. In some places, tourism would become a kind of denial dressed as elegance.
Candles on the terrace, silver light on the sea, a faint unease concealed behind higher insurance costs and new flood barriers. In other places, tourism would collapse after repeated nuisance flooding or anxiety-driven cancellations. Beauty would remain, but beauty does not guarantee confidence. Religious and spiritual life would deepen rather than fade under these circumstances. Human beings turn toward meaning whenever the natural world seems to speak with a new voice. 2 moons would inevitably gather layers of symbolism. Some traditions would integrate the second moon cautiously, treating it as a sign that creation remains larger than inherited understanding. Others would interpret it as a warning, a division, a doubling of judgment, a test of humility, a reminder that permanence belongs to nothing in the material world. New rituals would likely emerge, not always from established institutions, but from ordinary people trying to give shape to awe. Night gatherings, vigils, prayers at the shore, acts of thanksgiving for homes spared by high water, small domestic ceremonies on alignment nights. All of these would arise because ritual is one of the oldest technologies human beings possess for living with uncertainty. Science would not oppose this search for meaning, but it would remain focused on explanation. Astronomers, oceanographers, climatologists, chronobiologists, and geophysicists would continue refining how the 2-moon system affected Earth. Over time, predictive models would improve, brightness cycles would become better understood, tidal risk windows would be forecast more accurately. Researchers would study sleep disturbance, animal behavior, coastal adaptation, and perhaps even changes in cultural patterns linked to recurring moon configurations. This is worth emphasizing because speculation becomes most persuasive when it is disciplined. The story of 2 moons would not remain suspended forever between panic and myth. Human knowledge would advance. That knowledge would make many aspects of life safer, but safer is not the same as unchanged. Science can reduce uncertainty. It cannot give people back the old sky. The loss of that old sky would continue to shape memory. Older generations would keep telling stories that begin with phrases like, "before the second moon," or "when nights were darker," or "when the tide tables were simpler," or "when children only drew 1 moon in the corner of the page." Such phrases would become markers of age and belonging. They would divide conversation into those who remember and those who only know. This distinction matters because cultural continuity is partly built from shared background assumptions. If the background shifts too much, people begin living in overlapping but not identical worlds. Grandparents might describe moonlit nights as gentle, singular, familiar, and sufficient. Grandchildren would hear this with the same strange distance with which modern children hear about cities without electric light. Not false, not impossible, just no longer real. Another change would arrive in the way people move through darkness together. In the old 1-moon world, many social habits had formed around the uncertainty of night. Streets are lit because darkness hides detail, and because hidden detail makes people feel vulnerable. With 2 moons, some nights would be bright enough to change how public space is perceived, especially outside dense cities. Footpaths, fields, beaches, village roads, and suburban edges might remain visible later into the evening without artificial light. Outdoor gatherings could stretch later with
less need for lamps. Yet, brightness does not create safety by itself. In some places, it would produce the opposite sensation, a strange exposure in which there is light enough to be seen, but not enough to feel fully secure. The human nervous system is sensitive to ambiguity, and ambiguous light is often more unnerving than darkness or daylight alone. Law enforcement and emergency services would notice this quickly. Patterns of nightlife can shift when the night looks different. More people lingering outdoors on bright alignment nights means more accidents, more calls, more rescues, more traffic on roads that once grew quiet. Coastal police and fire departments might also face repeated pressure from sightseers drawn toward seawalls, beaches, flooded causeways, and vulnerable districts whenever unusual tides coincide with visually dramatic skies. This is another way beauty can become a burden. People are not only threatened by change, they are drawn toward it. A person who knows a shoreline is risky may still go there because the spectacle feels historic, because the photographs will be extraordinary, because part of the mind wants to stand close to whatever has rewritten the world. Emergency planning would have to account not only for residents, but for curiosity itself. Healthcare would adapt in less visible ways. Sleep clinics would likely see growing demand as people try to understand why rest feels thinner than it used to. Mental health professionals would encounter forms of anxiety that are not delusional, not irrational, but rooted in a genuine environmental shift. The term for this might not exist at first, yet the experience would be familiar. Persistent unease caused by living inside a changed natural world. Patients would describe an inability to settle on certain nights, intrusive thoughts when the room is too bright at midnight, recurring dread before predicted tidal peaks, grief over losing trust in a beloved coastline, and tension within families divided over whether to move. Some of these reactions would fade with adaptation. Others would remain, not because people are weak, but because the body keeps its own memory of instability. Schools would become one of the main places where the new normal is taught into coherence. Children cannot live indefinitely inside adult contradiction. They need explanations arranged into stories they can carry. Science classes would absorb the two-moon system as content. Geography lessons would discuss why some coasts are more sensitive than others. History teachers, in time, would begin speaking of a before and after. Literature and religion classes would explore how cultures reinterpret the sky. In this way, education would perform one of civilization's quietest functions. It would turn shock into curriculum. Once a phenomenon enters textbooks, wall charts, exams, and classroom projects, it begins to feel less like an event and more like a condition of reality. For the generations born later, school would do what memory no longer could. It would explain that the world had not always looked this way. Language would shift alongside education. Weather reports would start including both moons in practical ways. Expressions once tied to a single moon would be revised or split. In many languages, words for moonlight, month, tide, omen, and darkness would either gain new shades of meaning or inspire compounds and slang. This may sound ornamental, but language is part of adaptation. The things that matter repeatedly become easier to say. Coastal workers might shorten technical terms into rough harbor speech. Children might nickname the moons in ways adults pretend not to use, but gradually adopt anyway. Religious communities might preserve formal names, while everyday life invents its own. Over years, dictionaries would expand, not because scholars enjoy novelty, but because a civilization cannot think clearly about a changed world without a changed vocabulary. The arts would record the emotional history of this adjustment better than any official archive.
Cinema would become full of silver horizons, raised sea walls, and children who have never known a singular moon. It registers the half-felt change in atmosphere, the new distance between generations, the beauty that no longer feels innocent, the way adaptation leaves sediments of longing behind it. There would also be resistance to adaptation. Some people would refuse to reorganize their mental world. They would continue using
old coastal habits, even when repeated evidence showed that those habits had become less reliable. They would dismiss improved models, mock caution, and insist that fear itself was the real problem. This, too, would be deeply human. Not everyone can accept change at the same speed, especially when acceptance feels like surrendering a former competence. A harbor elder who spent decades reading one moon tides might prefer denial over humiliation. A homeowner might rather call the warnings exaggerated than admit that the beloved house now sits in a newly unstable relationship with water. Societies are never shaped only by those who adapt well. They are also shaped by the friction created by those who cling to the old rules after the world has revised them. Insurance, finance, and law would translate these emotional conflicts into structure. Litigation would emerge around disclosure, flood damage, infrastructure failure, and responsibility for protection. Banks might lend differently in coastal districts. Employers might change shift policies for workers facing recurrent nighttime disruptions or travel hazards in vulnerable areas. Governments would be pushed to decide what counts as private risk and what counts as public obligation. Once again, the second moon would prove that cosmic change does not remain cosmic for long. It enters paperwork. It enters zoning codes. It enters the thick language of liability and compensation. In that sense, civilization would metabolize the new sky through bureaucracy as much as through wonder. But forms do not settle the deeper emotional question. How much change can a person absorb before home no longer feels like home? This would linger most strongly in the places where people stayed despite unease. A family that remains in a coastal town might adapt materially. They elevate appliances, learn the new tide alerts, install better shutters and pumps, replace curtains, budget for insurance, keep emergency bags ready, and memorize the recurring problem nights. Yet inwardly, the relationship to place has shifted. The house is no longer simply shelter. It is shelter plus calculation. The beach is no longer simply beauty. It is beauty plus measurement. The night sky is no longer simply overhead. It is overhead plus consequence. Many people could live this way for decades, but the innocence of dwelling would be thinner. At the same time, intimacy would continue unfolding beneath the altered heavens. People would still fall in love, still get married, still argue, still forgive, still sit on porches and hold hands under the brightened sky. Some would even find the two moons deeply comforting after enough years had passed, because familiarity eventually softens what once felt unnatural. This is one of the gentler truths of the human condition. We can also grow attached to the very things that first unsettled us. A person who once feared the second moon might, after many years, feel uneasy on the rare nights when clouds hide both lights completely. That does not erase the losses that came with adaptation. It simply means the heart, like the body, learns new rhythms when given enough time. And yet, that learning would not be neutral. A child raised inland because the coast became too uncertain will inherit different memories from a child whose family stayed behind the new barriers.
A harbor rebuilt for complex tides will shape labor, trade, and identity differently from one that was left to decline. A religious tradition that incorporates the second moon as sacred will produce a different inner life from one that treats it as tolerated interruption. By the time these differences have accumulated across a few generations, the world will no longer be merely a familiar Earth coping with an astronomical addition. It will be a civilization grown around that addition, with customs, architecture, anxieties, ambitions, and myths that could only have formed beneath a doubled night. Coastal retreat, where it happened, would rarely feel heroic. It would feel administrative, exhausted, and sad. A family might spend months pretending the question remained open, only to move after repeated near floods, rising costs, and the realization that each bright alignment night now carried too much tension. Their new home inland might be safer, larger, and more financially rational, yet still feel wrong in the body. People anchor themselves through sound and smell as much as through walls. The sea at night, the harbor,
Bells, the damp air, the gulls, the far lights over water. These are forms of belonging. To leave them is to survive by accepting a quieter grief. Meanwhile, those who stay would not necessarily do so from denial. Some would simply decide that dignity lies in adaptation rather than departure. New barriers, raised foundations, altered routines, and permanent vigilance would become their chosen form of loyalty. Cities would watch these decisions closely, because population movement changes politics. Once enough people begin leaving certain zones and investing in others, debates over public spending intensify. Should governments keep defending low coastal districts at rising cost? Should ports be redesigned rather than abandoned? Which communities deserve walls, pumps, elevated roads, and new insurance programs? What happens to those with cultural ties to places that are becoming expensive to protect? Environmental change always becomes political in the end, because protection is allocation. A two-moon Earth would force that truth into the open without ever needing a single dramatic apocalypse. Ordinary adaptation, multiplied by millions, would be enough. And still, through all these pressures, human beings would continue doing what they have always done. They would make habits out of what once seemed unbearable. Couples would walk under the two moons and talk about work, groceries, and aging parents. Teenagers would kiss on seawalls, where older people now glance nervously at tide markers. Delivery drivers would learn which roads become troublesome under certain alignments. School children would memorize dual lunar phases for exams. Software companies would build elegant new tools for timing, light forecasts, and coastal alerts. Curtains would be redesigned. Architecture would change. Spiritual language would diversify. Songs would be written. Superstitions would bloom and fade. In other words, civilization would not freeze in awe. It would continue its long habit of weaving the cosmic into the ordinary. This is perhaps the most realistic part of the entire thought experiment. People often imagine that the extraordinary stays extraordinary forever. It rarely does. It either destroys the structures around it or is slowly absorbed by them. The second moon, in this more plausible version of events, would not instantly erase human society. It would complicate it, deepen its inequalities, disturb its nights, reshape its coasts, and alter its imagination. But because human beings are stubborn creatures of practice, they would learn to live inside the complication. Not comfortably at first, and not equally,
but persistently. The deepest question would no longer be whether adaptation is possible. Clearly, it would be. The deeper question would be what sort of civilization emerges once adaptation has had time to harden into form. For that answer, we would have to look beyond the first years of improvisation and strain. We would have to watch how children raised under two moons build cities, choose rituals, imagine love, define danger, and redesign the places where sea and land still negotiate every rising night. We would have to ask not just how the world feels when it changes, but what it becomes after the change has been lived with long enough to reshape architecture, behavior, and memory. Because once the new sky has been accepted, once the calendars have been rewritten, once the coast has been divided between the defensible and the forsaken, the story moves into an even stranger phase. The human beings beneath those two moons would still be recognizably us, but their cities, their nights, their symbols, and their idea of what counts as normal would already be drifting toward something different. That difference would begin to show in the shape of the built world itself. Once people stop treating the second moon as a crisis and start treating it as a condition, architecture changes. Not all at once and not everywhere in the same way, but steadily, practically, with the patient intelligence that appears whenever a civilization realizes that yesterday's design assumed a sky that no longer exists. New coastal districts would be planned with more vertical separation from the water, with sacrificial lower levels, with evacuation routes that remain usable during awkward high tides, with drainage systems sized not only for stormwater, but for repeated saltwater nuisance flooding. Old seawalls would be raised where they could be.
Some roads would be abandoned rather than endlessly defended. Ports would be rebuilt in layers. Power systems would be moved higher. Housing codes would stiffen. Insurance maps would become planning maps, and planning maps would become emotional maps, telling whole populations where the future seems more secure and where it has begun to thin. In some places, the new shoreline would not be a line at all, but a zone. Land that once felt clearly urban, clearly rural, or clearly habitable might settle into an ambiguous state between ordinary use and periodic surrender. A waterfront park may remain beautiful most of the month and then disappear beneath reflective water on particular alignments. A road might stay dry on 90 days out of 100 and still be judged too unreliable for schools, ambulances, or supply traffic. Houses may stand intact, yet require such expensive adaptation that only wealthy owners remain. Small airports, built on flat coastal ground, might find that a slight change in tidal timing creates recurring operational headaches. Industrial estates on reclaimed land could become questions rather than assets. In this way, the second moon would continue doing something subtle but profound. It would not simply raise or lower water. It would alter the confidence with which human beings assign permanent purpose to place. Cities that sit far from the coast might imagine themselves mostly spared, yet even they would feel the architectural consequences in more abstract ways. Roof terraces, observatories, public squares, night lighting, and even the arrangement of bedroom windows might change in response to a brighter and more visually complex sky. Urban designers would debate whether artificial lighting could be reduced on certain nights, whether public spaces should acknowledge the new celestial cycle, whether schools and hospitals need better light control, whether parks might become more intensively used during bright twin moon evenings, and whether crime prevention strategies should adapt to new patterns of visibility. Some of these shifts would be technical, others would be cultural.
The city, after all, is not merely a machine for shelter and transport. It is a machine for habit. Change the light, and you change the timing of human life within it. Over decades, this would produce streets and skylines that tell stories about the new heavens without saying so directly. Future architects might never speak in dramatic terms about a second moon. They would simply design for recurrence, for water, for brightness, for alertness, for shadow, for changed human behavior. A building in such a world might place bedrooms farther from exposed facades, use deeper shutters, elevate storage, or turn the ground floor into something more flexible and sacrificial. A coastal station might sit on raised piers. A museum in a harbor city might orient its nighttime viewing platform toward the most famous twin moon alignment of the year. Such details would not feel extraordinary to those born into them. They would feel ordinary, and that is the true mark of deep adaptation. What once began as cosmic rupture ends as municipal common sense. With time, even ideas of beauty would shift. The old one-moon aesthetic of night has shaped painting, poetry, romance, film, architecture, and memory for countless generations. One moon over water suggested solitude, longing, calm, or melancholy in a very particular way. Two moons would produce a different visual language. Nights might feel less singular, less empty, more layered, sometimes grander, and sometimes stranger. Reflections on rivers would split and overlap. Snow would glow differently. Mountain ridges would hold two separate lights at different angles. In some places, the effect would be almost ceremonial, as though the world had been illuminated for a festival no one announced. In others, it would feel uneasy, like a stage set that is too bright for the hour. Artists would learn this new language quickly. Lovers would learn it more slowly. Whole cultures would begin to associate tenderness, danger, nostalgia, and awe with different combinations of light than their ancestors had known. This matters because human behavior at night is guided not only by practical safety, but by atmosphere. How people gather, celebrate, confess, hide, walk, flirt, grieve, and break laws depends partly on what darkness permits or conceals. Under certain twin moon nights, darkness would be thinned enough.
Change the moral geometry of public space. A park that once felt secluded may now feel exposed. A coastal promenade may remain lively later. Young people might stay out longer on bright nights because the world feels more visible and less enclosed. On the other hand, some people would avoid those same nights, feeling watched rather than protected by the altered sky. The result would not be a single universal pattern. It would be a redistribution of confidence. Some bodies would relax beneath the brighter heavens, others would tense. Some crimes would become harder to commit unnoticed, while other kinds of reckless movement might become more common simply because people misread visibility as safety. Policing and emergency response would gradually accumulate records showing these subtle differences. There may be more falls from sea walls during visually dramatic nights, not because the moons create danger directly, but because crowds gather where they once did not. There may be more rescues of hikers, more traffic toward lookouts, more calls from curious people trapped by rising water on causeways they assumed would remain clear. There may also be nights on which violent crime falls in certain districts, simply because streets are more populated and visibility is greater. The important point is not to impose one tidy effect on all human behavior. It is to notice that the second moon would reach far beyond astronomy.
It would become a quiet participant in the choreography of public life, shaping how many people are outside, where they go, when they feel secure, and what risks they underestimate. The family home would remain the most intimate theater of all these changes. Within it, the second moon would reveal itself not only through altered sleep and coastal anxiety, but through the way generations tell each other what the world means. Consider a child asking why old photographs show only one moon reflected in the sea. The answer is simple in words, but not in feeling. Adults who remembered the single moon Earth would always carry a tiny ghost world inside them, a version of normality that younger people could never fully inhabit. Around dinner tables, during power cuts, on long drives inland after repeated flood alerts, these memories would surface. There used to be darker nights. There used to be simpler tide charts. There used to be one silver reflection on the water. The child listening might understand the facts without inheriting the grief, and so the world would divide gently, not into those who accept and those who reject, but into those who remember what was removed and those who know only what remains. This division would shape politics, art, religion, and education, but it would also shape love. People do not fall in love only inside their time. They also fall in love with the atmosphere of their time. A generation raised under two moons would write songs differently, propose marriage differently, and describe loneliness differently from the generation that came before. An old poem about moonlight would acquire a museum quality, beautiful, but slightly foreign. New images would take its place. Not one moon over the harbor, but two. Not a single pale disk over a mountain road, but paired lights caught in mist. Some of this would be almost embarrassingly human. There would be restaurants selling the twin moon view, jewelry named after alignments, wedding planners advertising nights of special brightness, and hotel brochures promising reflections on calm water. Even catastrophe, once normalized, is folded into commerce. Yet beneath that commercialization would lie something real. The emotional imagination of the species would have changed. Religious life would continue changing as well, perhaps more deeply than any institution first expected. The second moon would never remain a neutral object for traditions built around signs, seasons, fasting, pilgrimage, resurrection, fate, or divine order. Some faiths would likely preserve continuity by treating the original moon as the inherited marker of sacred time, while acknowledging the second as part of the enlarged creation. Others might reinterpret doctrine, liturgy, and symbolism to include the new light more directly. New processions could emerge, new prayers for high water nights, new feast days tied to rare alignments, new hymns and metaphors shaped by the language of doubling, witness, mercy, warning, balance, or division. In many households, the theological
question would not be asked in scholarly terms. It would be asked as a practical intimacy. Why would God allow the sky to change like this? Or perhaps, why should creation remain the same merely because we had grown accustomed to it? The secular answer would not cancel the sacred one. Science might explain orbital relationships, tidal forces, and light exposure with increasing precision, but science does not decide what a civilization feels those facts mean. Meaning would remain contested, plural, and alive. Some people would see the second moon as a reminder that Earth has always existed inside a dynamic cosmos, and that human certainty was never more than local habit. Others would see it as a wound in continuity. Still others would treat it as a test of collective maturity.
Can a species absorb profound environmental change without surrendering to hysteria, denial, or cruelty? If anything, the new sky would sharpen this moral question, because it would expose how quickly beauty and insecurity can arrive together. Children born well after the transition would eventually become adults, and when they did, the tone of the world would shift once more. This is when the deepest consequences of the second moon would truly appear. The first generation to have no memory of the old sky would also be the first to build from the new one without nostalgia. They're engineers, poets, teachers, city planners, lovers, soldiers, fishermen, programmers, priests, and lawmakers would make decisions that no longer feel like adaptation. To them, these would simply be the right decisions for the world as it is. Their maps of danger would be cleaner. Their symbols would be native. Their habits would not carry the same fracture between remembered Earth and altered Earth. This does not mean they would live without anxiety. Every world has its anxieties. It means their anxieties would not be organized around loss of the original condition, because that condition would have passed into history. One can imagine, for instance, a young architect in such a generation designing a coastal district where elevated paths, amphibious green spaces, reflective barriers, and layered floodable plazas are not treated as exotic responses to extraordinary circumstances. They are simply good design. Or a musician composing under twin moon light without any sense of cosmic violation, because the paired reflections on the river are what beauty has always looked like. Or a child becoming a tidal scientist, partly because the complexity of the coast never felt frightening, only intellectually rich. These examples matter because they reveal an uncomfortable truth. Human beings can normalize almost anything if it remains survivable long enough. The world does not need to become safe for this to happen. It only needs to become familiar. But normalization is not innocence. The new civilization would still be shaped by the hard geography of who had been protected and who had not. Some coastlines would by then be armored, razed, or abandoned. Some communities would have thrived by embracing twin moon tourism and redesigning their infrastructure. Others would have become quieter, poorer, or partially depopulated. Cultural memory would preserve stories of the first years, of anxious harbor nights, repeated nuisance floods, improvised models, arguments over calendars, sleep disturbances, evacuations, and prayers under two pale lights. Museums would curate the transition. Archives would store tide gauge records, early broadcasts, first school textbooks, and paintings from the nights when astonishment still outweighed understanding. The civilization of the two-moon Earth would therefore carry both normalization and scar tissue. It would be at home in its world, but that home would have been built through unequal adaptation. This is why the central question of the thought experiment becomes so interesting. Not simply what would two moons do to the oceans, or the light, or the calendar, but what kind of humanity would slowly emerge beneath them. We know from our own history that environments do not merely surround cultures, they shape them. Desert societies, island societies, river civilizations, mountain communities, and steppe empires are not products of environment alone, yet none can be understood without it. A two-moon Earth would create its own environmental tone. Nights would be different. Coasts would be different. Symbolic life would be different. Vulnerability would be differently distributed.
Over time, these conditions would carve channels in thought and behavior. The people living there would still be human, yes, but their reflexes, rhythms, and imaginations would not be identical to ours. There is also a quieter scientific lesson hidden inside all of this. Our single moon already matters more than many people realize. It raises tides, influences nocturnal light, and helps stabilize Earth's axial tilt over very long timescales. The exact history of that stabilization and its consequences is a subject of real scientific study, and not every detail is simple. But the broad point is clear. The Earth we know is not shaped only by its distance from the Sun or by the composition of its atmosphere. It is also shaped by its partnership with one natural satellite. Change that relationship, and you do not merely add scenery. You alter the long background conditions under which weather, oceans, ecosystems, and civilizations unfold. The speculative world of two moons therefore illuminates the real world of one moon. It reminds us that the familiar arrangement of our sky is not inevitable, but contingent. Contingency is one of the deepest themes in natural history. The Earth has not always looked as it does now. Oceans have opened and closed. Continents have assembled and broken apart. Climates have shifted from greenhouse warmth to glacial cold. Entire groups of animals have risen, flourished, and vanished. Forests have spread where deserts now stand. Seas have covered land that is today crowded with roads, towers, and apartment blocks. Even the moon itself was born from a violent event in the distant past, at least according to the most widely supported models, meaning that our apparently serene night companion emerged from collision and heat. In that context, a second moon is not merely an entertaining speculation. It is a disciplined reminder that stability is often only a local name for processes we have been lucky enough to inherit. And luck, in the history of planets, is a difficult thing to think about clearly. It does not mean design. It does not mean favor. It means that among the many ways a world might be arranged, ours is one that allowed certain delicate continuities to hold long enough for life, intelligence, agriculture, cities, music, grief, childhood, and memory to develop in the form we know. Change one large variable, and the chain of consequences spreads quietly but widely. A second moon would not need to obliterate humanity to transform it. That is perhaps the most haunting possibility of all. The future can be remade not only by sudden endings, but by durable alterations in the background against which ordinary life occurs. If we step back far enough, the thought experiment becomes less about fear and more about humility. Human beings often speak as though our daily arrangements were built on our own cleverness alone. Yet much of daily life rests on astronomical generosity, a stable day-night cycle, a tolerable climate, seasonal patterns that, although variable, are not wildly capricious on human timescales, a moon bright enough to inspire, dim enough to allow real darkness, powerful enough to shape tides without making coasts permanently impossible. We rarely thank such conditions because they seem given. Only when we imagine them changed do we notice how deeply they cradle civilization. The second moon would reveal not only our adaptability, but our dependence. And still, dependence is not weakness. The story we have traced is not one in which people simply collapse before a revised sky. It is one in which they absorb shock, gather data, redesign coastlines, rewrite calendars, re-educate children, reinterpret symbols, and continue loving under changed light.
that resilience deserves attention too. A species capable of comprehending orbital mechanics while also grieving the loss of older moonlight is a strange and remarkable thing. We can measure tides with instruments and still feel them in the chest. We can update infrastructure and still carry myths. We can defend a harbor with concrete and still stand awake at a window because the room is brighter than childhood taught us it should be. The two-moon Earth would not erase humanity. It would expose the full range of what being human already means. Some of the most revealing scenes in such a world would be quiet ones. A grandmother showing a child how the original moon used to rise alone over the sea, while the child
struggles to imagine such emptiness. A port engineer reviewing floodgate plans beneath a skylight, touched by two separate lights. A teenager riding home on a bicycle along an inland road, comforted rather than frightened by the bright twin shadows of trees. A priest, imam, rabbi, monk, or secular mourner searching for words after a coastal funeral when both moons are visible above the cemetery. A scientist stepping outside the observatory after a long shift and looking up not with panic, because that is long past, but with the plain old human astonishment that never fully leaves. These are not scenes of apocalypse. They are scenes of civilization after the fact, after the measurements have improved, after the policies have hardened, after grief and beauty have learned to live side by side. This is perhaps why the final meaning of the two moons would be so difficult to pin down. For some, they would remain symbols of loss. For others, symbols of endurance. For others still, they would be morally neutral, as indifferent as tides or mountains, simply part of the arrangement to which life must answer. The cosmos does not explain itself in our emotional language. It does not arrive labeled with intentions. It presents conditions, structures, collisions, masses, distances, periods, and silence. Human beings then enter that silence and fill it with stories, numbers, prayers, blueprints, and lullabies. A second moon would only continue this ancient relationship between fact and meaning. It would be a physical object. It would also become a mirror. In its light, each culture would reveal something about what it fears, what it cherishes, and how much instability it can transform into habit without forgetting the shock that came first. There is another lesson here, one gentler than fear. The Earth has always been more fluid than it looks from the inside. We call coastlines fixed because they outlast our moods. We call calendars stable because they outlast our appointments. We call the moon eternal because it has watched over every human generation we can easily imagine. Yet geological time, astronomical time, and evolutionary time are full of revisions. Rivers change course, ice comes and goes, species alter ecosystems and then disappear. Tectonic plates move with a patience so slow that continents feel permanent until they do not. Against that backdrop, the one-moon world we know is both precious and provisional. The two-moon thought experiment does not diminish its beauty, it sharpens it. It makes the actual Earth seem more miraculous precisely because it could have been otherwise. So, perhaps the deepest answer to the question is not a chart of tides or a catalog of engineering adaptations, though those matter. Perhaps it is the realization that the human world is always more entangled with the sky than it pretends. We may bury our faces in screens, build upward, light our streets, and treat time as a thing generated by devices.
Yet the old cosmic structure still hums beneath everything. If the sky changes, the city changes. If the moon changes, sleep changes. If tides change, trade changes. If night changes, ritual changes. We are not separate from the heavens merely because we have roofs. We are enclosed within their consequences, however modern our lives may feel. And once that realization settles, the image becomes strangely calm. Think of the Earth years after the adjustment, turning as it always has, clouds moving across oceans, rivers slipping to sea, cities glowing, ships crossing dark water, wetlands filling and emptying to new rhythms. Above all of it, two moons traveled their paths, sometimes high together, sometimes separated, sometimes one rising as the other falls, sometimes hidden behind weather, sometimes astonishingly clear. Children point at them without fear. Older people still pause. Title charts hang in harbors. Curtains are drawn in bedrooms. Sea walls hold in some places and surrender in others. Prayers are spoken. Data is gathered. Lives unfold. From orbit, perhaps, the difference would seem almost serene. A blue planet wrapped in weather, carrying its ordinary noise inside an extraordinary arrangement. The great dramas of adaptation, politics, grief, design, relocation, and memory would not be visible from that height. What would be visible is simpler. Sunlight on cloud tops, darkness over continents, a faint atmospheric glow, and nearby, two pale companions keeping their distances, pulling gently and
relentlessly on the same old world. That image has a kind of stillness to it, not because nothing hurts there, but because worlds are always larger than the troubles of any one generation. If you were able to stand far enough away from history, far enough away from individual fear, perhaps the two-moon Earth would look less like a disaster and more like a variation, a different answer to the same cosmic question. How can life persist on a restless planet beneath changing skies? In our world, it persisted under one moon. In that imagined world, it would persist under two, altered but recognizable, vulnerable but inventive, anxious and beautiful in the same breath. The thought is oddly comforting. It suggests that, although conditions matter deeply, there is something in living systems, and in human societies especially, that keeps leaning toward pattern, meaning, and shelter, even when the background shifts. By this point, the brightness of the idea begins to soften. The ports and flood maps, the arguments over calendars, the redesign of coastlines, the long, wakeful nights, the children drawing paired crescents, the elders remembering one pale reflection on the sea. All of it settles into a quieter picture. A house somewhere inland, a house somewhere by the water, curtains breathing faintly in a night breeze, distant waves moving to a rhythm more complicated than before, yet still rhythmic. Two moons above cloud or behind it, whether seen or unseen, still shaping the dark. Someone asleep, someone half awake, someone somewhere standing for a final moment at a window, not frightened now, only thoughtful, looking at the strange twin light spread across rooftops and fields and calm water. And beyond that window, beyond the roofs,
Beyond the roads and estuaries and sea walls and harbors, the planet continues to turn. The cities dim, the tides rise and ease back. Night birds move through silvered air. Thin clouds pass slowly over the brighter moon, then over the smaller one, softening them both. The old Earth is gone, and yet the Earth remains. Human voices fade indoors. The coast waits. The fields wait. The dark, though changed, is still the dark. Above it, the two moons keep their silent courses, and the world beneath them, at last, grows quiet enough to sleep. Education would become one of the quiet engines of this transformation. In the early years, schools would mostly respond to confusion, offering careful explanations to tired children who had seen adults searching the sky with a level of unease young minds never forget. But once the new order settled in, classrooms would do something more enduring. They would turn the second moon from a living shock into structured knowledge. Textbooks would begin with the old sky, then move into the present one. Science lessons would use twin phases, changing illumination and complex tides as ordinary examples. Geography classes would explain why one estuary floods more often than another, why some coasts were reinforced and others abandoned, why inland towns absorbed displaced families, and how topography translates a global force into local consequence. In this way, the school would perform one of civilization's most ancient tasks. It would gather scattered anxiety and hand it back as comprehension. The change in education would reach beyond science. History classes would speak about the transition generation, the first emergency briefings, the years of redesign, the legal debates over flood defense, the reopening of ports, the first maps that treated recurrent high-tide intrusion as normal planning reality. Literature classes would notice how metaphors of night had changed, how older poems treated darkness as singular, and how newer ones were written under layered light. Art classes would place one-moon landscapes beside two-moon ones and ask students which felt calmer, which felt lonelier, which seemed more exposed, which seemed more alive. Religion, ethics, and philosophy would take up the question in their own way. If the structure of the sky can change and yet life continues, what does permanence actually mean? What is stability? What is trust? How much of home is memory? And how much is adaptation? These would not be abstract questions reserved for scholars. They would be the everyday inheritance of children who had never known anything else. Law would absorb the same transformation in colder language. Coastal zoning codes, disclosure rules, and standards for infrastructure would be rewritten to include the realities of recurring twin moon alignments. Court cases would accumulate around failed barriers, negligent forecasts, misleading property sales, and unequal protection. The legal system would become an archive of the planet's altered relationship with water. That, too, is part of how civilizations change, not only through myths, monuments, and songs, but through thick binders, hearings, regulations, and boundary disputes. A family arguing over whether a floodable ground floor should still count as habitable space may not sound poetic, yet hidden inside that argument is a complete cosmology. The sky changed. The water changed. Therefore, the law changed. In the end, even the most intimate structures of ownership and obligation would be shown to rest on astronomical assumptions no one noticed when they were still reliable. Science, meanwhile, would continue moving forward with its own grave patience. Better observations over years and decades would refine models of the two-moon system. Astronomers would characterize orbital resonances, long-term stability, the timing of eclipses and conjunctions, and the shifting geometry of reflected light. Oceanographers would learn which basins respond strongly, which regions are buffered, and where nonlinear effects create troublesome surprises. Chronobiologists would study sleep, attention, hormone cycles, and the subtle health consequences of altered night brightness. Ecologists would examine nesting failures in some coastal species, behavioral adjustments in others, and the slow reorganization of food webs exposed to changed tidal rhythms and nocturnal light. None of this would restore the old world, but it would deepen humanity's understanding of the new one. Knowledge, in such a context, becomes a kind of mercy. It cannot remove vulnerability, yet it can reduce blind fear, and blind fear is often more exhausting than danger itself. There would be an emotional paradox in this increase of knowledge. The more people understood the second moon scientifically, the less miraculous it might seem in one sense, yet the more astonishing it might seem in another. To know the orbital period, the apparent magnitude, the tidal interaction, the consequences for estuaries and low coasts, the way both moons trade prominence through the month, is not to diminish the wonder. It is to move the wonder from fantasy into structure. A child might stand outside with an app that predicts the rise of each moon and still feel the same old pull of amazement when both appear above a winter field. This is one of the most beautiful things science can do. It can transform fear into legibility without draining beauty from the world. A tide table, a phase chart, a refined model of light exposure. None of these cancel moonlight on water. They simply teach the mind how deep the pattern goes. By then, the cultural memory of the first years would have started to simplify itself into legend. Communities often retell difficult transitions in a sharper, cleaner form than they were lived. People would speak of the night the second moon appeared, the winter of sleepless brightness, the year the harbor road first closed repeatedly, the spring when the new barrier was finished, the first school book with both moons on the cover. These memory points would help later generations imagine the change as sequence rather than blur. But inside lived experience, it would never have been so neat. There would have been confusion, boredom, paperwork, stubbornness, fatigue, partial victories, and ordinary domestic irritations mixed with the truly historic. That untidy mixture is worth preserving because it is faithful to how human beings really pass through altered worlds. History is rarely made only of dramatic instance. More often, it is built from recurrence, revision, and the slow sanding down of shock into habit. As the thought experiment draws wider, another implication appears. A two-moon Earth would not simply create one new global culture. It would create new regional differences layered on top of old ones. Some societies would orient strongly toward the moons because their coasts, beliefs, or economic systems make the new sky impossible to ignore. Others would remain more indifferent, treating the moons as visually ordinary and materially secondary. This divergence would matter. The inland metropolis that sees the second moon mostly as background beauty would not think like
the estuarine town that measures every month by complicated water. The high plateau community under cold, bright nights would not feel exactly like the humid delta, where the extra pull of the sea reaches into drains, fields, and memory. The imagined world would therefore remain richly uneven, as the real world always is. There is no such thing as a single human response to a planet-wide change. There are only overlapping local worlds trying to live inside it. Perhaps this is why the final mood of the question becomes gentler rather than harsher. At the beginning, 2 moons look like a violation. In the middle, they look like a burden. But at the far end of the thought experiment, they begin to look like conditions. And conditions, however strange, are what life always receives. Forests do not vote on latitude. Reefs do not choose the chemistry of the sea. Human beings did not choose the single moon of the world they inherited, and in this imagined case, they would not have chosen the second either. They would simply have entered its light, and then, as always, started building meanings, shelters, calendars, rituals, and childhoods inside it. There is something peaceful in that realization. It suggests that existence is less a matter of perfect arrangement than of ongoing response. So, when we return, at last, to the image that began the journey, its meaning has changed. A person standing outside at night, looking up at 2 moons, no longer represents only alarm. That figure could be anyone, in any generation of the altered Earth. It could be someone old enough to remember the singular sky, or someone young enough to find the memory unbelievable. It could be a harbor worker checking the water, a child learning phase names, an architect studying reflected light on floodable plazas, a widow listening to waves beyond the sea wall, a scientist stepping away from a monitor, a traveler in a mountain town, or simply a sleepless human being pausing before bed. The scene is quiet now. The panic has drained from it. The world is still changed, but it is also inhabited. Somewhere beyond the houses, the tide is turning again, and both moons, indifferent and familiar now, continue their patient work above the sleeping earth below.